Well, good evening, everybody. The title of my session is Stewardship of the Mind. Now, when you hear stewardship, what do you normally think about? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Taking care of what God gave you.
Well, yes, right. Most people think about money, right? But you're absolutely right. It's more about what God has given you and what you're supposed to do for His kingdom with it, because it's not yours in the first place. Now, He's given us something that's much different than any other creature here on earth, and that's our intellect. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. And we'll talk about how this relates to, well, first of all, how this came about, how the church is in the position that it is today, and why the mind is such an important part of clearing up the moral confusion that we have today. So that's how I'm going to take this session and kind of blend it into what we're talking about overall in this conference. And then my talk here will dovetail right into the keynote tomorrow when he talks about scientism and relativism and how that affects the culture. So I'm going to give you more about how we got up to that point, and then some things that and some resources I'll give you by the end that you can use to kind of combat that. So we're going to talk about how we got to this place in the first place. So first, I like to always start off with the problem. What's the problem? What are we having today? So some people don't know that there's necessarily a problem, but I think that they'll find, and you'll find a number of Christian authors, and I don't know if you can read all that from way back there, but I can tell you what it says. Basically, we're talking about Christians have ceased to use their mind, just in general. And it's not necessarily the fault of the church that you're with or anything like that. And it's not every Christian, of course. I'm not trying to make a statement that's overall of the church, because there's some really good churches out there. There's some really bad ones, unfortunately. However, publicly, public perception and the way a number of very vocal Christians may speak out is showing that they're downplaying the mind. Right? And you probably heard something. Well, I don't need to know about the facts. I just believe. But the facts are in our favor. Why wouldn't we want those facts? And this is a key point. And this hasn't been something that's just been happening recently or just happening in the United States. It started in Europe, and it's moved its way across the Atlantic to the United States. And Western Christianity, Western culture is in part suffering from this. And you have a number of people, I don't know if you've ever heard of Mark Knowles or R.C. Sproul or folks like that. They've written on this topic before about Christians and using their minds and how they're not using them right now. So Richard Hofstadter, which I thought was really good, he made a comment here, and he said, Christians view humble ignorance as being more noble than a cultivated mind. Have you ever seen somebody, a Christian, a fellow brother and sister that was in that mode, right? And so that's what we're talking about today. How did we get there? How do we get them out of that, right? And that's what I want to talk about today. Why is this important? I think Bruce already talked about this at the very beginning in his introduction, and that is, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge, right? So do you think God is saying, don't use that mind that I gave you, that I only gave you, I didn't give any other creature created here on earth? Do you think He would rather, this is just a hat rack, right? We're just going to use it as a hat rack, right? No, I expect that He thinks that He expects us to use it as a matter of stewardship. And even in the Old Testament, He talks about this. And if you actually take this and you say, okay, I'm going to read through the whole entire Bible, I'm just going to look for God talking about using my mind, what knowledge is for, you will find it everywhere. Right? And so that's what I want. And so sometimes we don't. Now, the problem is there's a battlefield out there, and that is universities and the media. And this isn't a conspiracy. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. They're all out to get us. But whether you're left or right or conservative or liberal, they all recognize this. Even Noam Chomsky, anyone know who he is? Very liberal person, not a friend of Christians at all. He even recognizes that the media shapes the culture, that the universities shape the way people think. And so how do we know about that? What has that led to in our society? And one of the problems we have, again, I'm saying that this is not a conspiracy. They have been fully forthright in explaining to us what they were going to do. What do I mean by they? Humanists and stuff like that. For example, there's Charles Francis Potter and John Dunphy and some other people that are in the education industry, and even people that worked for the Department of Education back in the 30s. Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday schools meet for only an hour once a week and teaching a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? So the point that he's making is how can we... and he's on the other side. He's not on the Christian side, right? He wants you all to believe in atheism, basically. And again, he wrote that in the 50s or 60s or something like this. They're making the point that we have the children 5 days a week for 8 hours a day or 7 hours a day in school. The church has them for 1 hour on Sunday, and they don't even have all of them. They wanted to change society, and they've done a very good job of changing society doing this. And that's where we have to respond to it. And college is a battlefield. This is very interesting statistics. Right there, 53% of the respondents, which were all college professors, 53% of college professors do not, what does it say? They harbor unfavorable feelings towards evangelicals. 53% of them. That's not that they're neutral. That's not that they see that as positive. That's that they're negative and hostile towards it. So we send all our kids off there, and how much time and energy have we spent trying to train them and equip them to be able to answer that when they go to college? And sometimes you send your kids to a Christian college and you think that you're going to get good teaching there, but the statistics are showing that even Christians going to Christian colleges oftentimes will also walk away from the faith. But again, they haven't been equipped before they've been sent. And this is an important thing. Frank Turk recently wrote a book, excellent book, which I would recommend for you. It just came out like last month. It's called Atheists Are Stealing from God, or something to that effect. Just read it, but he said, professors are rightfully unimpressed with the inability of most Christian students to defend their beliefs. So when they come to their classrooms and the students are not prepared to defend their beliefs, and most of those professors are hostile to evangelical Christianity, what do you think that is going to make a difference in everything, right? Chuck Colson once said that in those schools and in the universities, they're not showing both sides of the coin. Hey, this is the Christian worldview, or this is Christian-based morality, and this is humanist-based morality. They only show the humanist-based morality, and they mock everything else. So now your students, your children get sent into that situation, or if some of you are young enough here, may even be in a situation like that if you're not going to a Christian college, and sometimes even if you are. So what are the statistics showing us about children being sent off to college? And depending upon which poll you have, a number of these polls have been done from 2002 to 2006 or 2007. We're talking about 60 to 88% of students going to college leaving the faith. That's kind of scary. Lifeway Research did do an interesting thing on their poll. They tried to look at those students later, like 10 years later, to see did any of them come back. And they found that 35% of them returned to faith. That's still a big chunk of them that have left and not come back, right? Because they weren't equipped when they got sent in the first place. And so this is one of the things that we want to look at. And USA Today kind of rehashed some of the story there as well. They were talking about 70%. Again, depending upon what poll you look at, it's everywhere from 60 to 88%. So I think it's safe to say somewhere near 70 is probably a very accurate number of how many. So Frank Turk, in the same book that I was just talking about, it's not so much that Christian minds are lost at the college, it's that Christian minds rarely get to college. They rarely get to college because many parents and churches emphasize emotion and ignore the biblical commands to develop the mind, which means that most kids skip off to college equipped with nothing more than feel-good emotionalism. And what can that do when you have someone, even if the reasoning is wrong, and all you have is emotionalism, how are you going to stand against that? right? Very difficult to do that. Ravi Zacharias once said, and I think this is a great quote, "A tepid Christianity cannot withstand rabid secularism." We have to stand firm on this. We have to teach our children how to stand firm on it. We have to equip them to use the mind that God gave them. So how did this come about? This is a little bit of a longer section but I'm going to kind of breeze through it, and I'm going to give you the highlights so that you can kind of see where this developed from and how we got here. But I'm teaching this at our local church this coming semester, and it's going to be a longer 8-week type course. So you're getting the condensed 1-hour version of it. But I don't want to leave anything out for you, right? Because this is all important stuff. So where did we come from? I have a timeline here that says from the 1600s to today, kind of giving you an idea so that you can look at this, what has happened in the secular side of things and what has happened to the church. And you can see where the moral foundation of Western society, which was based on the authority of the Bible, whether you were Catholic or whether you were Protestant at the time, has been shifted from that and put onto something else. And now that it's shifted from there, what has that led us to? So let's start off with the Puritans. And if you look at the Puritans, one of the things that they were very concerned about was the whole person. Not just the spirit, not just the heart, but also the mind. They looked at all 3 parts of it. And if you read a lot of their works, one of my favorite books is a book of Puritan prayers. And it's really interesting because you can see all the different aspects of the Christian life all brought together under, nice, really solid theological prayers. But if you read Mark or Luke, they say, when asking Jesus what was the most important commandment, was what? Right? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind. Right? So part of loving God, part of being a part of His kingdom, to move His kingdom forward, is also to use your mind there. And they looked at the whole person, and that's what they were focusing in on, right? So when you have people like Jonathan Edwards, who was considered one of the biggest intellectuals in America at the time, you see the Puritans creating some of the most profound universities, like Harvard University, not the Harvard University of today, where it got its original reputation from. The fact that during that period of time, the literacy rate was 89 to 95%. And most kids could read and write by the age of 6 in Puritan households. So they were not intellectual slackers in any way, shape, or form. Of course, they didn't have distractions like TV, internet, and all those other things. They had a lot of good books, and that's what they spent most of their times. So as you can see, during the 1600s and into the 1700s, that Puritan ethic came through, looking at all aspects of it. Now, coming along slightly after that, 1700s, you had 2 different things happening. One, Immanuel Kant and David Hume starting to question, being skeptical of the biblical narrative, being skeptical of the Bible itself. That was more on the philosophical side, that was more on the other side. Then you had revivalist movements that focused, especially when you talk about George Whitefield, focusing on the emotional aspects. The thunder preachers and all that stuff. Jesus loves you. Don't worry about anything else. Jesus loves you. That's all it is. All based on emotionalism. Had thousands of converts, but it was all based on emotionalism. It wasn't based on well thought out, intellectual, theologically sound arguments. It was all based on emotion. And so the focus there was more on experience. And so there's a number of movements that happened throughout the 1800s that took the church and moved it more towards the emotional aspects. Jesus is your personal Savior. He loves you. You have a relationship with Him. Jesus has a relationship with everybody. And what He has to say, not only just for you and me, but has to do with society as a whole. So there's a difference there in approach, right? So focus on experience. Then theology was separated from the other disciplines in the colleges. Most of the colleges before that, Sir Isaac Newton, theologian and scientist. There wasn't a warfare between theology and science. He brought them both together. Today we think that there's some type of warfare, and I'll show you that this is all completely made up. Actually, without Christianity, you can't do science. That's a longer story. Get Frank Turk's book if you want to read the whole thing. But he'll write that out for you. So, we see in the colleges, because we're focusing more on emotionalism, we're starting to retreat in the colleges. Students are being less concerned. Now you can get degrees without having any theology in your background. You can just work on science proper without having necessarily theology beyond it. J.P. Moreland said of this, but their overall effect, these revivals that we have were focused on emotionalism, the overall overemphasized immediate personal conversion to Jesus Christ instead of the steadied period reflection and conviction, emotionally simple, popular preaching instead of intellectual, careful, doctrinally precise sermons. Personal feelings in relationship to Christ instead of a deep grasp of the nature of the Christian teaching and ideas. Right? So you have to think about this thing. If Jesus Christ is God, that has a lot to think. That's the most ultimate question. And that says a lot about every aspect of life. And so we have to take that into consideration when we look at. So, George, George, whatever his last name is, his whole idea here in his quote is that anti-intellectualism, this is, we're against the intellect. This started to foster in that time during those American revivalist things. Great that we brought a lot of people to the Lord, but we brought them to the shallow end. And we left them on the shallow end. We didn't take them out to the deep end. We didn't teach them how to swim. Right? And that's what we're talking about here. So what else happened? Well, shortly after that, the church is going off over here. We're going to do our big, hugs and all that kind of stuff. And in universities and all this stuff, we have folks like Darwin, right? Now he's giving you an alternate explanation of reality. So now, see, society is starting to be moved off of its foundation, its Western Christian foundation, and it's starting to move towards secularism, towards atheism, towards humanism, which is a worldview without God. He's planting the seeds there. And then two gentlemen writing two different books, Draper and White, they postulated that there is this warfare between science and religion. They started off with Galileo, and then they basically said the church was persecuting him. He was a scientist. He was trying to do this. He was trying to just follow science where it led, and the big old bad church was trying to hold him down, and they have a bunch of stories that they just relate that the church is against science. Unfortunately, most of their information was inaccurate, and therefore their conclusions were inaccurate. The whole entire thing, Galileo was a Christian. He died a Christian. He did it for the glory of God. So it wasn't necessarily, it was two different worldviews, Aristotelian, which the church had accepted in the past, in other words, heliocentrism, or geocentrism rather than heliocentrism. And Galileo was trying to move them over there, which was completely consistent with what the Bible said. In addition to that, which makes it a lot more complicated, Galileo was kind of a jerk. And he kind of rubbed the Pope the wrong way, so to speak. Labeling the Pope a fool, kind of, and characterizing him as a fool, which didn't win him any favors. Again, all he got was placed under house arrest for his heresies, and which were related to other things and not even necessarily about his findings, his scientific findings. Which, by the way, just to add another note, his scientific findings actually didn't prove what he thought they proved. He thought the tides proved that the Earth went around the sun. The tides don't prove that. The tides prove the moon goes around the Earth. They don't prove the Earth goes around the sun. So he had a lot of problems with this stuff, and rightfully so at the time. They said, you don't have enough proof. You don't have enough scientific proof to make your claim. Even though your claim is correct, which they didn't say, but hindsight's 20/20. We know what that is today. So during this period of time, the church is getting away from being very careful and precise about their theology, getting more into this huggy-feely stuff. And guess what popped up in its place? During this period of time, Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnessism started. Again, the church is now moving away from this, and out of that, all kinds of other different cults, I guess is what we would call them, other alternatives to Christianity started popping up in absence of Christianity. And so where does that leave us today? Right? So how did that get us into today? Well, part of it today, culture's perception today is that science is fact and religion is myth. And Dr. Scott will talk about that tomorrow. But just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. However, it's important because Darwinism laid the foundation for some things that we'll talk about that lead to this moral confusion. Because under a Darwinist worldview, in other words, if you are nothing more than the product of random chance, and it's just a bunch of stardust just happened to come together in one location, and it's all by random chance, Darwinism, that worldview, plays a strategic part in rationalizing everything from eugenics to euthanasia, to infanticide, to abortion, to Marxism, to relativism, and to even genocide. You have a hard time getting there from a Christian worldview. In fact, I would say you have an impossible time getting there. You can't take the words of Jesus, love thy neighbor as thyself, love your enemy, and then say, oh yeah, we're going to go kill everybody. It doesn't work. Those are incompatible. With Darwinism, if you're just a product of random chance, well, that makes perfect sense. So now this is what we're dealing with. We have a world that is looking at it through this other worldview, that you're just a product of random mutation and selection, or you have that you were made in the image of God, that Jesus Christ died for each and every one of us. He paid an infinite price. He's an infinite being when he did this. He paid an infinite price for each and every one of you. How can you say that genocide or eugenics is the right worldview if Jesus died for it? You can't. You can't come to that conclusion. But if we're sloppy in our thinking, we don't realize that we're just borrowing over here from this other worldview, then it makes it really easy for us to say, well, abortion's really not that bad. But we're borrowing from another worldview. We're not borrowing it from a Christian worldview. So what is the impact? Again, theologically shallow Christianity, based on emotions. And I mean, J.P. Moreland goes so far as to say it's more of an illiterate form of Christianity. That's kind of harsh words, but maybe it's justified in some places. And I'm sure you've seen some Christians on TV that maybe is true of. So during this period of time, some Christians became very suspicious of anything intellectual. Because again, we retreated out of the universities. And now the universities are saying it. They're supposed to be really smart and they have doctors and their PhDs. Must be true, right? And they said it. Well, from their worldview, maybe it's true, but not from a Christian worldview or from reality. So all of this moved towards this, and we'll talk about it. And again, like I said, of course, picture from Auschwitz here. This worldview, Darwinism, atheism, it allows you to get to some conclusions that Hitler did in genocide and stuff like this. Can't get to it from a Christian worldview, but you can do it from there. And it's really interesting what Alexander, I can't even say his name, I won't even try. What he says here, he says, men have forgotten God, and that is why this has happened when he was talking about Auschwitz. Men have forgotten about God. Again, this is taking that foundation from society and moving it over. And it's all being done. So what is the influence on culture? Well, now that culture's moved this way, they've kind of moved away from Christianity. They don't look to Christianity for authority on moral issues anymore. They look where? Government, yes. Because where do you get your rights from? The government. You get your rights from who? Whatever the Supreme Court says. Not from God, not from your Creator. That's a huge world of difference. If the government giveth, the government can take away. This is the thing that we should be concerned about as Christians in a nation like this, as we are participants in it. So there's a secular subculture in the American education system for the most part. I work in the education in public colleges. I can guarantee you and I can attest to it that it's there and it's alive and it's well. It's not. It's not a conspiracy. They're very upright and forward about what they are attempting to do. They're very influential as they control the institutions that provide the official definitions of reality. Right? Because where does the Supreme Court rely upon for their information? These experts. So influence on the church. So there's a big misunderstanding of faith's relationship with reason. Some people think faith and reason are antagonists to one another, and they're not. The Greek word most often used for faith is actually better translated trust. Trust in what you know, what information you do have, what reasons you have to believe. That's different than just believing with what we would call a blind faith. That is, I don't know, I'm just going to do instead. Right? If God gave us a brain, I don't think He'd want us to use blind faith. I think He would want us to use our minds to come with rational decisions. So, in part, we end up with an irrelevant gospel. It's only about touchy-feely, Jesus loves you, that's about all we can say. Well, Jesus loves me, but I can still go do all these other things. And so we have a lot of people that say, yes, Jesus loves me, and they go out and live as if Jesus doesn't exist. And that's incompatible. If Jesus exists, then He has a lot to say about our lives, about culture, about morality. And so we had a little bit of a loss of boldness, too, in confronting this. So the National Study of Youth and Religion, 2001 to 2005, they actually did some stuff. A gentleman called Christian Smith was the lead investigator on this. And basically, he came up with the definition for what a lot of most churchgoers that we have in the United States are. And they fall into this new category that he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. It's a very fancy word, right? And if you've read some books, you may have run across this because a lot of authors have talked about this. But basically, it says that God exists, that He created everything, but He's kind of distant. He's leaving us on our own to deal with our problems, and we have to kind of work it out ourselves. So I pray to Him so that He can make me feel happy. That's what He's all about. He's just there to make me feel happy. So I'm going to talk to Him about Him making me happy. That's what most of my prayers are about. And most of my happiness is going to be related to getting that new car, or getting this new TV, or getting whatever this new thing is, or more money, or a better job, or whatever it is. God is not particularly involved in the person's life other than that when we call on Him, rub the magic lamp and ask for our wishes, and then all people go to heaven when they die. And He's a loving God, therefore everybody gets to go to heaven. Again, if we don't have our thinking caps on, when somebody says, well, God's a loving God, everybody's going to go to heaven, they forget that that's only one of His attributes. He's also a just God. And that injustice requires payment. And it doesn't require that you accept if somebody else made a payment for you. Right? So if we think through this, an all-loving God would not be very loving if He did not punish people like Hitler. Right? It wouldn't make any sense. Would it? So they wrote a book about this, and you can look up the book that talks about the whole entire story, and it gives you all this information. And one of the points that he brought out is not so much that the U.S. Christianity is being secularized. Rather, more subtly, Christianity is either being degenerated into a pathetic version of itself, or more significantly, Christianity is actively being colonized and displaced by quite a different faith. This is what's happening in the churches. And so you have a lot of people in a lot of churches that are preaching information, going back to this emotionalism. God wants you to have everything. So pray for that Mercedes and you'll get it. Right? And so this is where you're coming into this. So a lot of this, I got to check my time to make sure I don't go too far. So a lot of this has to do with what I would call a double-minded person. And that is, they say Jesus is God, but on the other hand, they say other things that contradict with that. Like, I'm pro-choice. They don't realize the implications if Jesus is God. Being pro-choice is not the correct view. Sorry, it just isn't. So I like to look at it. So we have to ask our question, if we want to understand what the Christian worldview is, if Jesus Christ is God, what then follows from that? If He is God, what does that have to say about morality? About how I should act? If He is the King, and He is my King, and I'm a steward of everything that He's given me, what should I do with all of those things? Become a monk, right? Not necessarily, right? Everybody has a different position. I'm not telling everybody to become a monk. So how does that do that? But oftentimes what people will do is they'll say, yes, Jesus is God, but I'm going to go out here and I'm going to say, well, your morality is fine, and your morality is fine, and everybody's morality is fine. That's just yours. This is mine. We can get along with that. Well, and that's called relativism, where you basically say everybody's moral values are equal. Are our moral values equal with Hitler's? You see how easy how ridiculous this is? If you just think about it, how many of you heard somebody say, well, you have your morality, I have my morality, or something along those lines? If you watched TV last night, I'm sure half the shows were talking about that in one way or another. So what ends up happening is people now start to compartmentalize their life. They act one way at work, they act another way at church, they act another way at home, another way with their kids. You know what I'm saying? They start to compartmentalize. Yes, I'm a believer, but when I go to work and I do stuff, I cheat and steal like everybody else does in the office. Again, that's not compatible. Because you're saying Jesus is God, oh, but it's all right to help people defraud the IRS and not pay all their taxes and lie on their tax forms. That doesn't work. So what you end up having is they've compartmentalized their lives and they act differently in different places. And that doesn't make sense. If Jesus is God and He's the ruler of everything, then I should be a Christian everywhere I go. And that Christian morality should follow everywhere I go. And even if you're a businessman, whatever Christian morality is still needed in business. So I'm not saying everybody needs to become a monk or become a pastor or get a ministry. Wherever you put, you still have to let this flow from there. Because God plants us in different places. Different people come into our lives. We can influence them for good, for Jesus. We become a witness for Him. People become interested in saying, hey, I really like you. Because you stand up for what you believe. And I'm attracted to that. I had a friend of mine, my wife's friend and her husband, they come over from time to time. They're both atheists. They know we're Christians, and we still have them over. Just because they're atheists, I'm not going to not have them over. So one day he came up to us and he said, you know what? Out of all of our friends, you two have the best marriage. And I try to emulate like you guys do in your marriage. That spoke volumes to me. It really spoke volumes to me because I'm not trying to be different when they're around and different when other people are around. I'm trying to be the same all the time. And so I think it's very important for all of us to use as a takeaway. Do you remember the DC Talk? Remember DC Talk, big Christian group from back in the day? They said the greatest, and I love the quote in it because it's in a song and a lot of kids probably listened to it at the time. The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and deny Him with his lifestyle. Right? Think about that, right? That is simply what an unbelieving world finds unbelievable. I mean, if you think about that. Because I talk to atheists all the time online. The first thing they always want to point out, you Christians are all hypocrites. I have a hard time saying, well, first of all, us being hypocrites has nothing to do with whether something is true or not. First thing, logic, let's use that first. But unfortunately, you can't get them past that. They want to keep on harping on that. And so it makes anybody's job who's trying to, entice somebody with the gospel, makes our jobs a lot harder when Christians are being hypocrites about things. Again, this is all from this double-mindedness. We're not... So this leads to the moral confusion that this whole conference is about, that we're talking about here. And so, because we're living as if God is God, but then we live as if He's not. Right? How are we doing this? How are we trying to juggle this? So what does God say about being double-minded? Do you think He likes it? No, not at all. In fact, He says, I hate double-minded people, but I love your law. Well, that's what I think David was saying when he said that. James, he talks about a double-minded man, and he's unstable in all of his ways. And of course you're going to be unstable. You're not going to be on a solid foundation if you're standing one foot on Jesus, the rock, but most of your weight's over there in the sand. It's not going to work, is it? Right? You've got to be all the way on the rock. How do we fix this? I'm not going to leave you here without telling you, how to fix this. Here's the problem. All right, bye. So we got to talk about how to fix this. Well, part of this is, and any of you know what a Jews, they'll have like a little thing called a phylactery. It's a little black box that they do and tie on their thing and tie it on their head. This comes from this verse. It says, fix these words in your mind and on your hearts, the words of mine in your hearts and on your minds. And so they put these things on there, but they're not, I think God didn't mean it literally. what he means is he wants you to dwell on these things, right? So we should be spending time in the Word, obviously, with this. But he wants you to use your mind with it. It's not just your heart. Now, I'm not saying I want you all to become Mr. Spock, right? You're all going to be logical and emotionless. Absolutely not. It's both. There has to be balance between it. So I'm not saying become Mr. Spock. But here's the other one, too. In Romans, Paul says, do not be conformed to the age, which would be adequate for us today, too, when we're talking about Darwinism and all those other things. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? So that you may discern what is good, pleasing, and the perfect will of God. Renew your mind so that you can discern, right? So part of that is, yes, you have to spend time in the Word, but it's not just the Word, right? You can't properly interpret the Bible if you don't know things like how to interpret the Bible, right? So there's other things that come before it, basic logic and stuff like that. So this is an important part of it. And I have the little graphic here that kind of shows your mind. When you first come to Christ, He takes over your innermost being. But now there's a war from that point forward. Paul talks about this quite a bit, where you need to get out of your life, out of your mind, out of your heart, out of your will, and all that kind of stuff. It needs to be more conformed to Him, right? To His kingdom and for His purposes. We usually call that sanctification. It's not something that happens overnight. You're not just perfect the next day. So you have to work towards cleaning that trash out and getting Christ to be the king of that area of your life. And let's talk about the mind. So it's also about the mind. So your mind's mostly dark when He comes in there. Now you have to start to renew your mind. And as you do it, then it becomes less cluttered and more clear. And you can see reality clearer. Right? So this is part of the process. Part of sanctification is not just about all these other things. It's about thinking. Thinking correctly. Thinking Christianly, as if Christ is God. And if He is God, and He has some things to say about everything. So what does that equal out to? So if anything is excellent and praiseworthy, think about such things. So he's kind of telling you how you should be doing this. Thinking about these things. Not just emotionalism, right? Greg Koukl in his book Tactics, page 32. I didn't have to tell you actually. But anyways, in his book he says, the mind, not the Bible, is the first line of defense God has given us against error. Think about this. Because I can tell you two other groups that use the Bible and they use it in a twisted way. Right? So how do we protect ourselves from that? We need to use our minds. We need to renew our mind so we can have discernment. Right? So that's what we're talking about here. This is kind of what he's talking about. And he says, rationality is one of the tools God has given us to acquire knowledge. Now that doesn't mean, you remember the parable of the talents, right? Not everybody got the same amount of talents. Right? So king comes and says, here, you're going to get 1, you're going to get 5, and you're going to get 10. So if he's giving you this much intellect, that much intellect, or this much intellect, what did he expect of all of his servants? To increase it until he came back. It's interesting that he said the one guy that didn't do anything with it, what did he do with it? He buried it in the ground. What do ostriches do with their heads when they're fearful? Buried in the ground. I don't know if there's a corollary there, but it might work. So we're talking about stewardship of the mind, right? So we're talking about, it's not related just to money. It's and stewardship is an interesting concept. If you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's really interesting. The responsible use of resources, especially money, time, and talents, in the service of God. This is their ecclesiastical definition of what it means to be a steward. So it's not just about money. Parable of the talents we already talked about. Your intellect is one of the greatest gifts God has given you. How should you use it? Should we increase it for His kingdom? Right? I would think so. And you know what stewardship means? It means you're responsible. I hate to say this. Now that I've told you, you're not responsible, right? It's a responsibility thing. So where do you start with this? Obviously, reading the Word of God is one of the first places you need to start, but also reading other things other than that. And there's a lot of great Christians that have written books about this. Love God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland's a good one. Os Guinness just wrote a book last year called Renaissance. And I think it's James White wrote a book called A Mind for God. These are all recent books, and they all talk about this. There are some older classics that you can use, but these ones are brand new, kind of out, and they're more relevant to what's going on culturally today. Interesting thing is, reading is completely different than watching TV. You don't watch TV passively. TV can be telling you a narrative, and in that narrative there is a morality that's being sold to you that you're not thinking and discerning through. And that's just the way TV is. You're just immersed into the story, and you just watch it, you enjoy it, or whatever you do with it. But most people don't discern what's being said to them. How many ever watched the show Cheers? What is that about? What's the morality behind that? Well, think about it. What was Sam Malone doing the whole time? He was chasing every skirt that came into the bar. And that's every episode. And the ones that he wanted the most were the ones that he couldn't have. What does that say about morality? Yeah, it's a funny show with all the other things, but the whole entire theme of the whole entire series, whatever, how many seasons it was on, 9 or 10 or something like that, the whole entire narrative, the whole thing is about him just trying to get in bed with some lady. That was what the whole thing is about. So if you're just watching that, you're not thinking about it, you're just thinking, oh, Norm came back in and he's having another beer and he had a bad day. But the narrative and the morality that's being sold to you in the background that you're not even aware of is, hey, sexual freedom, do whatever you want. Not what the Creator says, because that's boring, right? So we have to be able to discern. You can discern easier when you're reading a book. It's harder to discern when you're being hit with audio, visual, and everything else. It's really harder to do it. It's not impossible. So James E. White, in his book, he said, when he figured this out, when you start talking to people in culture and stuff like that, and you're trying to reach them for Christ, he said, I knew I had to outthink those who were challenging my faith, and to outthink them, I knew I had to outread them. Interesting, huh? So part of it is choosing what to read. And it's like a diet, too. 50 Shades of Grey is not going to help you. Sorry. It's just not going to help you. So what do we need to read, right? Basic books on logic would be a good place to start. Obviously, the Bible is a very good place you want to start. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I think of it like a diet. I'm not saying you can only just read no non-fiction. You have to read all non-fiction. No fiction whatsoever. Every once in a while, maybe once a year, I read a science fiction book. Just to get my mind off of, because I read a lot of theology and all this other stuff that I'm reading. So every once in a while, I do need to take a break. But I look at it like this. It's just like a diet. You can't have a diet of Twinkies. You're going to die. Intellectually, you can't have a diet of Twinkies. You have to have something substantial. And most of what you consume intellectually needs to be substantial. Right? So it sounds boring, right? Because now you feel like you can't watch TV anymore. Trust me, there's a lot of good books out there. So it may not be easy to do, especially in the culture that we're in, but it's not impossible. And anything that it's worth doing may be difficult, and you should do it anyways. Should you read widely or just well? It's better to read well. You don't have to read everybody's opinion about every little nuance of every little thing. Read the best books. And some of the classics are classics for a reason. They do teach morality throughout the stories. So it's worth looking at those things. Like one of my favorite science fiction movies is Forbidden Planet. Anyone seen Forbidden Planet? Great movie, talks about the monsters from the id. This is a great example, if you think about it, of the sin nature that is in man. That's deep down into that they don't know about, and what that outcome can be. So you can still read something like that, that's science fiction, and this, they can still have a good moral point to it, right? So you can still get stuff from it. Obviously, books like The Hobbit and stuff like that, the Narnia Tales, written by J.R.R. Tolkien and by C.S. Lewis, who meant to give you the intellectual and the moral moorings, but give you a story around it, right? So there's good stories out there like that. There's plenty of that kind of stuff to read. Obviously, the Bible is foundational for that, probably every day. Interesting thing, this Norman monk in the 1170s came up with this Latin phrase, and basically what it says, a monastery without a library is like a castle without an armory. So what does your armory look like? Just a question. That's what mine looks like a couple years ago. I kind of extended it a little bit. Anyways, but the question, it's a good thing, because what kind of books are you reading? What books have you read in the last year? Just that, you don't have to answer. But it's something worth thinking about. And what about discipleship of the mind? What does discipleship mean? Train somebody up, right? So what about training other people up into using their minds for God, for His kingdom, as God intended, right? So how do we do that? Well, there's an interesting thing here. It says more than 50% of the 18 to 29-year-olds in church aspire to have careers in science and technology. However, only 1% of adult pastors' leaders ever address science in their teachings. You see there's a little bit of a problem there. Again, we're sending these kids out ill-equipped. They need to understand that science has a philosophy underneath it. There's a philosophy that's related to God, and there's a philosophy that's absent God. And depending upon where you put science as its foundation will determine how you interpret the results. Science is not anti-religion. In fact, science can't be done without religion, in reality, without Christianity. Other religions can't be compared to it. And this is very important because we believe that God created an ordered universe. That He is a God of laws, and that those laws exist. Not just moral laws, laws of gravity and things like that. Because we believe that, there's an objective truth to things. It's not a relative thing. What does an atheist have? Why should they suppose that evolution favored an intellect that looked for truth? Does that aid in people surviving? Survival of the fittest? Truth doesn't necessarily aid in survival of the fittest. So why should an atheist, if the atheist world is true, worldview is true, why should they trust their intellects? Very sophisticated argument. I can't get into all of it here, but if you really want me to dazzle by it, Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga wrote a number of books on it. It's a very interesting read. It may be a little difficult at times, but the point is well made. I think it's a sound and valid argument that if atheism is true, how do you even trust your thoughts? How can you trust them? Interesting. Anyways, so science and religion aren't against each other. And sometimes people call this apologetics. And this is apologetics conference. You're obviously interested, and that's why you're here. But those same issues are all talking about this use of the intellect. We have same-sex marriage. How do we deal with it? You have to think about this thing, and you can't do this buddy-buddy hug thing. There's a group of liberal Christians out there that are training lay people in the church to go back to their churches to start at the ground floor and work up to change the church, to be accepting of same-sex marriage from the bottom up. When I was down in Viola a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to lectures by Sean McDowell and others. They showed us the information that they have and the questions they said to go ask of your church and of your pastor. I'm frightened of those questions because I find that most pastors would not be able to adequately answer those questions. They're very intellectually tricky. And if you don't think through it, it's easy once you think through it, but it's really hard to think through it. Things like, God's love and He loves everybody, little things like that. Now, I'm not saying all pastors are that way. I'm not saying that at all. But they are purposely going out to change the church from within. They realize scholastically, in other words, with other theologians, they can't make their case. And so they're starting from the bottom and trying to work their way up within the church. So how is the church going to respond to that? And my concern is I don't know that a lot of my friends that I know in church are able to answer those questions and those objections. They're very difficult objections. And most of the time they're very emotionally based. Not logically based, not rational, mostly emotional. So how are we going to deal with that? Especially if our church has always been about huggy-feely stuff, right? And then they give us a huggy-feely argument. Now what? Where do we go? hopefully we go to the Bible. Hopefully we use the head that God gave us and all that stuff. So discipleship of the mind. What should churches be doing with this? We should be focusing on this at all the different levels, in small groups, in sermons on Sunday, everywhere within the church. If you're an intellectual in the church, you should bring people up. Join different groups, whatever you got to do, and show them that using their mind is what God had intended for them. Integrate it into all the different aspects. This Herbert guy said, in their uncompromising determination to proclaim the truth, Christians must avoid the intellectual flabbiness of the larger society. They must rally against the prevailing distrust of reason and the exaltation of the irrational. Emotional, self-indulgent, and irrationalities have always been the enemies of the gospel, and the apostles warned their followers against them. And then that's what we're talking about today. Now, you may say, oh, well, now where do I go from there? That's my information, but I'm going to have to fast forward through this because there's a bunch. I have a bunch of slides in here, and I want to show you the last one, unfortunately. I just have to, no, you know what I'm going to do? Escape.